First of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Lord Allardyce once again for his very kind invitation to share some of my ongoing research with all of you colleagues at CRIC, both in Oxford as well as online. So let me just get into this. As Lord Allardyce is saying, my presentation is about what I call not violent extremism. And this is a perspective, I guess, from Southeast Asia, not representative from Southeast Asia, but just one perspective from Southeast Asia, of course. So at the time available, just want to perhaps bring us through various understandings of the term extremism, much used term, right? I want to take the opportunity to explore in the time I have two modes of what I call extremist dangerous speech. I'll explain that. And ultimately, what I would like to do is to argue that, you know, when people talk about non-violent extremism, I mean, this is a phrase, well, certainly in Southeast Asia, more and more people are talking about it, more and more analysts, right? I would argue that there's actually no such thing as non-violent extremism. There is just extremism in different modes of operation, in particular two modes of operation. So that is my essential argument. So when we talk about non-violent extremism, certainly in Southeast Asia, there has been an increasing level of interest in this. For example, some scholars, this is a Malaysian scholar based in Singapore, Farid Alatas, he's saying that there are individuals who have extremist ideas, but who are against perpetrating violence against others. They're extremists in that they may have exclusivist, misogynist, and literalist ideas about religion, but, and this is the key point, they are at the same time against violence, ergo non-violent extremism. There was a very interesting paper earlier this year by these academics who are based at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute, a leading think tank in Singapore. They wrote about non-violent extremism as well in the region. Their argument is non-violent extremism is generally to them the rejection of the use of force in pursuing a cause. So it's quite a straightforward understanding. But if you look at the term extremism, I mean, there's been a lot written about it in the literature, in the academic literature. I mean, one understanding is extremism is extreme, right? It's a deviation, a set of beliefs that is a deviation from the norm or the majority belief system. Douglas Pratt, a New Zealand scholar, talks about how extremism involves taking a particular in-group identity, might be religion or tradition, to an extreme, basically intensifying and amplifying that particular identity and making it the mainstream, you know, moving from the fringes to the center, right? So that's inflating one's own group identity. Klein and Kruglansky also talk about how extremism can be understood to be zeal or profound conviction for a particular position on any given issue. Engel Rabasa and colleagues from RAND Corporation in the US talk about how extremism could also mean totalitarian, anti-democratic ideologies, intolerance to the views of others, us and them thinking. So these are well-known understandings of extremism. But what about extremism and violence? You know, in the literature, you often see this linkage being made, right? Extremism and violence. So Alex Schmidt, University of Vienna, talks about how extremists are positively in favor of the use of force to obtain political power, right? And if they are, in terms of their real power situation, they are relatively weak, they will hide their true intentions, right? The British scholars, Eatwell and Goodwin, talk about how, agree, you know, that extremism does involve the implicit or overt acceptance of violence as legitimate. J.M. Berger, in a recent book, agrees in the sense that he thinks that he would argue that extremism refers to the belief that in-group success or survival must include at some point hostile action against an out-group, including violence, right, even genocide. So I always find that some of the work done by Professor Alex Schmidt from University of Vienna is quite useful I mean, I think it's fair to say that I've been quite influenced by his arguments in this space, right? So he makes a distinction between that other term, which is often used in the literature, radicalism. And he makes a useful distinction between what he calls open-minded radicalism and closed-minded extremism. So to him, open-minded radicalism refers to those guys who are rational, open-minded. You know, they're willing to debate with you. They accept democracy, they accept human rights. They can be radical, but they can be tolerant, pluralist, anti-authoritarian. Schmidt says that, you know, the problem really isn't the radicals, right? The problem is the closed-minded extremists. These are the people with the closed minds. They participate in the democratic process only as a stairway to power, right? They're supremacists, they're authoritarian, they reject equality and diversity, and they have no issue using political violence, right? And they are intolerant, dogmatic. So based on Schmidt's musings and my own, I would posit, right, that the main problem is not radicalism, even when at times, you know, it could lead to some forms of violence. The real challenge is actually extremism, which, as has been suggested by many scholars, positively accepts violence in politics and can lead to terrorism and even genocide. So extremism is the real policy challenge. But you see, even if you talk about extremism, it's not always so obviously violent. And this is where we come back to the problem of non-violent extremism. And we do have examples in Southeast Asia. For example, this gentleman, Abu Bakr Bashir, who is a spiritual leader, he has been prosecuted in Indonesia. He's acknowledged as a spiritual leader of the Jamaah Islamiyah terror network, which is Al-Qaeda related. I mean, when he gives his messages in public, for example, this is some of the things he has said. You know, essentially, he promotes in public rather intolerant picture. For example, he has said, you know, God has divided humanity into two parts, right? The good guys and the bad guys, so to speak. There are those who are, you know, those who follow God's law and those who don't, right? And we would rather die than follow that which you worship. We reject all your beliefs, reject all your ideologies, reject all your teachings of social issues, economics, or beliefs. So it's a very black and white, you know, kind of thinking, and it's intolerant. It's not violent. It's not inciting. It's not directly inciting, but it's not friendly, right? Between you and us, there'll forever be a ravine of hate. There'll be enemies until we follow God's law. Not friendly, pretty intolerant, but does not directly incite violence, right? So when Bashir was asked by a journalist, right, so you know your messages sometimes not really friendly, very intolerant, and he had this to say, you know, I'm only a craftsman selling knives. I'm not responsible for how those knives are used, which was a very interesting thing to say, especially when you think about what he actually does say in private. And an enterprising Australian journalist once was able to actually join a group which was supposed to be a relatively close group, right? And Bashir was speaking, and this time he kind of like was far less, you know, careful in his comments. He was saying that, you know, the non-Muslim tourists in Bali are, you know, akin to worms, snakes, maggots, the animals that crawl. Say the Australian infidels are immoral, called upon the young Javanese to beat them up, don't tolerate them. So this is direct incitement to violence, right? And he also was saying that, you know, Muslims in Indonesia should reject the laws of the nation's parliament, right? And you should follow, you should not follow state laws, right, if they do not follow Sharia, right? So this is, well, seditious. And basically, Bashir's point to his crowd of young Indonesians, Muslims, was that, you know, don't be scared. If they call you a hardliner, wow, fine, right? So my point is, to me, Bashir is an extremist. In public, he says one thing, right? In private, he says something else. So the thing is, I could argue that the religious extremists can toggle between so-called non-violent speech and violent speech, depending on his assessment of the evolving situation, right? Which is why Alex Schmidt actually says that you shouldn't really talk about non-violent extremism. And I would suggest that maybe you should talk about not violent extremism, right? Why? Because we are not talking about Gandhi and non-violence, As Schmidt argues, Gandhian non-violence is radical. It is not extreme. Gandhian non-violence is a philosophy that seeks to hold a moral high ground in the face of violent opponent. So, i.e., no matter what you do, the Gandhian approach is you will never respond in violence. That is principled non-violence. But extremism is not non-violent, right? Extremism is what, as what Schmidt says, is not violent or not now violent, simply because, to quote Schmidt, the non-use of violence is based merely on pragmatic, tactical, and or temporal considerations. So it's not a philosophy of non-violence. It is an assessment as to when is the right time to use violence. So to me, there is no such thing as non-violent extremism. There is only extremism, which is usually not violent until the right time and right circumstances for violence to be used. In similar vein, the terrorism analyst Astrid Botticher, she also agrees with the view of Schmidt, that's Alex Schmidt below. According to Botticher, holding extremist views about the political will to translate thoughts into action might be more a question of circumstances and opportunities than principles. So it's not a philosophy. Not violent extremism is not Gandhian. Not violent extremism is a principle of tactical appreciation of the situation to know when is the right time to engage in violence, right? And I just want to zoom in. I mean, I've written about this before, but for today, I just want to zoom in on one key element of the not violent extremists, which is dangerous speech. Now, I borrowed this idea of dangerous speech from Susan Benesch, who essentially defines, who includes in dangerous speech, for example, speech content that is very dehumanizing. I mean, we dehumanize the outgroup as vermin, pests, insects, etc. I argue that when you look at the dangerous speech of the not violent extremists, there are two modes, right? In the hard mode, the guy is, he is really directly inciting violence, I mean, he doesn't soft pedal anything. He says, go and kill the members of the outgroup. So when he says this sort of thing, go and beat them up, don't tolerate them, right? He is clearly a violent extremist, actively inciting or even engaging in outgroup violence himself. However, and this is my view, extremists can also operate in the more subtle, soft mode. They can use discriminatory or dehumanizing rhetoric, but they will be careful not to explicitly incite violence because they don't want to fall afoul of national laws. This is when the extremists would be operating as a not violent extremist. So the point is, the guy is an extremist and he's just shifting. He's shifting between the soft and the hard modes of dangerous speech, or put another way, shifting between being a not violent extremist and a violent extremist directly inciting violence, merely depending on his tactical appreciation of the situation. I'll give you an example in Southeast Asia. I mean, there are a fair number of examples, right? For example, there's this well-known Buddhist extremist monk in Myanmar, Ashin Viratu. He has gone to town describing Muslims in Myanmar as, all those dehumanizing rhetoric, right? Right. So, but the thing is, when he's approached by journalists, he says that no, he never encouraged attacks. Nowhere in his sermons he argues does he implore followers to take up the sword. Although this journalist Francis Wade, who wrote a very good book on Buddhist extremism in Myanmar, he did point out, and very, very correctly in my view, that Viratu may say that he doesn't actually incite people to do anything directly, but he does lay down tinder that could easily catch flame, right? And meanwhile, the US NGO Justice Trust did a study, and they did report that outbreaks of violence often coincide with Viratu's speeches or posts on the 969. 969 refers to Viratu's movement. 969 is now known as Mabata, which is a Buddhist fundamentalist movement in Myanmar. I mean, Viratu, similar to Bashar, I mean, Ratu is a Buddhist extremist, I would say. Bashar is an Islamist extremist, and the extremists, the not violent extremists, right? They tend to hide, right? They tend to play games, right? So this guy tells a journalist, "Look at my face. I don't have any hatred at all," right? Anyway, Facebook eventually they took action because his sermons online, his messages online were seen to be creating a lot of problems in Myanmar. So Facebook removed his account February 2018. In fact, just last year, Facebook imposed tighter online community standards for their election. But anyway, now as we know, the NLD government was deposed by the military, unfortunately. And in fact, when you talk about Buddhist extremism, there are other figures, even in Sri Lanka, South Asia. This guy, Nyanasara Tero in Sri Lanka, he is the leader of a group called the BBS, which is the Bodubala Sena, which is similar to Mahabharata in Myanmar, right? So they are Buddhist fundamentalist movement. So there was a particular meeting between the scholar of religion Michael Jerrison and Nyanasara Tero in Sri Lanka. And again, Jerrison was trying to figure out why is the BBS so strident in its rhetoric against the Sri Lankan Muslims, right? And this is what quoting from Michael Jerrison's book. It's very interesting, saying that there's no explicit use of prima facie in the BBS rhetoric, but there is an implicit logic within the narrative. Something needs to be done, or Sinhalese Buddhism will become obsolete. So violence is not named, but it's implied. It is implied. So the Buddhists who listened to Nyanasara Tero's speech understood this. The following day, they attacked the nearby Muslim community. And it's not just the Buddhists. Of course, this audience will be very familiar with the Islamist extremists. This is Hamid Abdul Samad is a German-Egyptian political scientist who was an ex-Islamist, right? In a recent book, he wrote about the dangers, the subtle dangers of not violent Islamist extremism. That is my analysis of what he's talking about. So to him, right, I was saying, like, to utter a word like kafir is to embark on the first step to violence, treating those with different beliefs or ideas like animals and paving the road to acts of terrorism and murder. Again, the not violent extremists, preachers may not openly endorse violence, right? They may not openly endorse violence, but their social views and treatment of others legitimize, strengthening the spiritual framework behind Islamist terrorism. So this guy is pretty strong in his views, right? He says that no one who lets, in his view, the Salafis preach anti-democratic, anti-human sermons of hate in public has the right to be surprised when sooner or later their messages lead to violence. So in other words, not violent rhetoric may eventually spark out-group violence. And it's interesting, in the US, there's the Anti-Defamation League. They actually came up with a pyramid of hate, right? I won't go into big details on this, but you can see that there is a progression from biased attitudes where there's no violence, no physical violence, right? But there's stereotyping, there's insensitive remarks, microaggressions. It progresses eventually to acts of bias, or in terms of ridicule, name calling, dehumanization, belittling, jokes, slurs, epithets. If some of these influencers, extremist intellectuals win election to parliament, right? They can try to pass laws which are discriminatory in terms of economics, politics, education, employment. At some point, a minority go further. They go into bias-motivated violence and eventually leads to genocide. So this is, to me, a very interesting and very telling pyramid. And one aspect, and coming to the end, one key aspect of not violent extremism, which has a lot of interest, generated a lot of interest, is this whole issue of linguistic dehumanization of outgroups. A lot of literature on this. For example, Daniel Chirot, Clark Macaulay talk about how when outgroup members are compared to animals or pigs, rats, maggots, cockroaches, a relation between disgust and genocide established, because these disgusting characteristics of the outgroup threaten to pollute the environment and must be eliminated. So words do matter. Words do matter. They do have a psychological effect, right, on communities. Craig Haig Bosmedian in James Waller, very good book by James Waller, Becoming Evil, right? his argument is that the distance between the linguistic dehumanization of a people and the actual suppression, extermination is not that great. So what are they saying? Not violent, but intolerant, dehumanizing, for example, memes. Lots of memes now on social media, right? These memes, if they are not violent, but intolerant, dehumanizing, they could, in tandem with other supporting factors, eventually help precipitate out-group violence. And there are lots of memes. I mean, this is a particularly telling anti-Semitic meme, right? It's very dehumanizing, right? So this is, I mean, it's everywhere on the internet, right? So these have implications. So what are the implications? To me, to go back to what I was saying at the start, I do not think there is such a thing as non-violent extremism, right? To me, there is only extremism, which is arguably not violent until the right time and the right circumstances for violence to be used. So this is why I agree with Alex Schmidt's view that international community should therefore challenge and resist all extremism, whether it's violent or not. Violent extremism is not the problem. Extremism per se is. In particular, today we focus on one aspect of the extremist, which is his dangerous speech. An extremist dangerous speech can manifest in either the soft mode, which is the non-violent mode, or the hard mode, which is the violent mode, right? If you're a violent extremist, you're in hard mode. So the point is, these are not two different people. They are the same person operating in two different modes. And extremists can toggle between either the soft mode or the hard mode, depending on the situation. And I think one important thing which I tried to also bring out indirectly in the presentation today is that, you know, extremism does not belong to any particular religion. At least in Southeast Asia, you can certainly see that, you know, it's not just any particular faith. I mean, you can see various faiths, Buddhism, in South Asia, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, they do have certain extremist manifestations. So the bottom line is there's a need for constant vigilance by the relevant stakeholders. All right, with that, thank you very much.